All right, everybody. This is take 2 of today's lecture number 10. I was giving it earlier, and there was a little bit of a technical difficulty with the recording. So we're going to go through round 2. This is for everybody at home for Wednesday, September 16th lecture. And today we're talking about testosterone. First thing we'll do is, here's a couple exam questions. Remember, exam number 1 is in 1 week, next Wednesday. That'll be available from 7 a.m. till midnight. You'll have 90 minutes to complete the exam, and that'll just be on the honor code that you're not going to be using your notes while you're doing that. And you're going to get the most out of this class if you actually do the studying, want to take it with you. That'll be the best way for you to move forward with the class. In my opinion, it's a wild time right now with COVID, so that is the best option. I know that the lockdown browsers and those types of options have a lot of problems inherent in them, so I don't even want to mess with that. I just want you guys to get the best opportunity to learn a lot about drug use in sport. So questions on all of the past PDFs from our lectures, great place to start. Also, a little bit later today, you will see the study guide from section number 1 being posted in module number 4 for week 4. Use those two things together. Email me if you have questions. Okay, let's move on to student questions. Kyle had our first question, and he said that we know that UW differentiates between a first positive test for marijuana versus other street drugs. And the University of Wyoming classifies street drugs as a number of different things, like cocaine, marijuana, obviously. LSD was something that I think Phil brought up, or Pete brought up in their lecture. Some of these other drugs that are not necessarily performance-enhancing drugs. But the difference is with the NCAA, they differentiate a little bit different. They have a group of drugs called illicit drugs. And within the group of illicit drugs, they only have THC and heroin. That's it. Every other drug that they test for is classified as performance-enhancing. So they classify cocaine as a stimulant, and therefore it's performance enhancing. So if you test positive for cocaine in an NCAA drug test, you get a 1-year ban. If you test positive for cocaine at the University of Wyoming, or probably other universities as well, that is classified as a illicit drug or a street drug within the university, and you go through the testing for that. So the answer to this question is, does the NCAA have the same differentiation? No, it's totally different, and it's a lot more stringent overall, but they do have a difference for marijuana and heroin versus other performance-enhancing drugs. Now, do they make a difference between marijuana and heroin? No, they do not. Those are all the same, and you get a 50% ban for testing positive for those. Okay, so much different than I thought it was going to be. I thought it would be pretty similar to what we do, but it's not. Okay, number 2. Jordan had a question. What changes has the NCAA made to account for states' legalization of medical and recreational marijuana use? And the answer to that is none. Absolutely none. The difference, though, is that the NCAA has done a little bit of a, kind of finger in your ears. I don't want to hear about it as far as marijuana use within their athletes goes, because they only test at championships. So when they test for out-of-season athletes, the NCAA contacts the University of Wyoming, says, hey, we're going to be testing your athletes, get these athletes for these sports ready. Actually, hang on one sec. All right, we're back. Sorry for that brief little interruption there. And to finish up with Jordan's question, what changes has the NCAA made? None, but they only test during competition season or during championship season. So that wouldn't even be in early times. That would be kind of towards the end of the season. If we think about college football, that would be once they start getting into bowl games, that's when they would be testing for that. Okay. The last part here is Garrett said, how are schools in Colorado able to avoid testing for marijuana even though they are part of the NCAA? Why does CSU and CU test for caffeine and alcohol while the University of Wyoming does not? Okay, really, really good questions. And the answer to that one is it's up to the university. They get to choose what they test for. The university does not necessarily have to pass along their positive test to the NCAA to say, oh, hey, by the way, 3 of our athletes tested positive for the same things that you test for. No, the university's testing policy is only in place so that they can kind of preempt some of the testing by the NCAA. If you think about the purpose of the testing for the NCAA and the universities themselves, they're very different. The NCAA tests because they want to make sure that the competition playing field is fair. That's their number one testing rationale. They want to make sure that all athletes are on the same kind of playing field and no athletes are taking drugs that are going to enhance their performance and make it unfair for one team versus another. The University of Wyoming is looking out for their student athletes' health and well-being. They test for things that they think are associated with that, and they also don't want their athletes to test positive for the NCAA tests. So they test for things that they think are associated with that. The CSU and CU choose not to test for marijuana, partially because it's legal in the state. Why would I test for something that's legal in the state and punish my athletes for them just adhering to the laws of the state that they're living in? That's kind of where that gets a little bit shady. The University of Wyoming tests for it because it's not legal in this state. And so they're trying to prevent their athletes from breaking the law. If those athletes are out using drugs that are illegal in that state and happen to be observed by a police officer, that could ultimately affect their ability to play. Also, the health consequences of these drugs are kind of unknown right now. The long-term studies have not necessarily been done, and we don't know what that is. On the other side, the second part of that is, why does CSU test for alcohol and caffeine? It's because, once again, they want to preempt the tests of the NCAA, and they also think that those are potentially things that athletes could be abusing and put them at risk for health consequences. So they've chosen to do that. University of Wyoming has not. That's why those universities have different university testing procedures, okay? But if a CSU athlete goes to a championship competition, tests positive for marijuana, they're not going to be able to say, well, my university doesn't test for that, so therefore this doesn't matter. Nope, they're still going to test positive, and they still will get the punishment that any other athlete from a state that didn't have legalized marijuana in it. So it's a little bit confusing there, but I hope that answers Garrett's question. Great questions. Keep these ones coming. They really make me dig into, I have to look at the code. I have to look at the WADA documents. I have to look at the NCAA statements. It's really great because it gets new content in every semester specific to what you guys want to learn about. So keep these questions coming. Let's move on. Testosterone. That's what we're talking about today. I should be able to get through this a little bit quicker overall. But first, we need some definitions, because if you look in your textbook, it's classified as an anabolic, androgenic, steroid hormone. Now, what do those 4 different terms mean? So anabolic means constructive in relation to metabolism. So something within your body is being created. The opposite of that would be catabolism. Something's being broken down. So we know we're building something with testosterone. It's androgenic, meaning it's related to the development of secondary sex characteristics. So these are characteristics that we classically identify with male or female sex. So for males, that would be, growth of facial hair. And for females, that would be, something like development of breast tissue. And we classically see that with male athletes who take too much testosterone. We're going to go into the process a little bit later. They will start to get increased estrogen because there's too much testosterone. It gets converted to estrogen, and then they'll get the development of secondary sex characteristics that are typically associated with females. Okay. Steroid means it comes from a gland, and also that it's derived from fat. Okay. And we'll get into that a little bit later as well when we get to the Leydig cells. The fat typically comes from cholesterol consumed in the diet. And if you look into the literature and, go on to Twitter if you want to have a bad afternoon and look at strength coaches and nutritionists who are talking about the importance of dietary fat, and they're not wrong, because dietary fat is where we're able to create our steroid hormones from. Okay, so important part of the diet overall. This doesn't mean you can go to Born in a Barn for breakfast, lunch, and dinner and just eat chicken wings all day long. No, that's not necessarily what you need in order to get the maximum amount of testosterone, but you do need to have some dietary cholesterol, which can come from plants as well. Okay, last one, hormone. It's a signaling protein secreted from the glands overall. The glands we're talking about here with testosterone: testes, ovaries, and adrenal gland. And we'll show those in a little bit. Most of it coming from the testes. Now, what does testosterone do in the body? Well, number one, right here, is it's a signal to increase the production of muscle and bone. So when testosterone circulates throughout the body, we're going to go into the mechanism by which it gets into the cell and then gets into the cell nucleus a little bit later. Actually, that'll be on Friday's lecture. But we know that that signal relates to increased production of muscle and bone. Number two, related to that, is it also helps to maintain muscle and bone. So just because you're not doing something that would necessarily increase muscle protein synthesis, just having circulating testosterone is going to help that protein to stay around. And lastly, it acts on the central nervous system. So we know it has peripheral actions in the muscle and bone, just like we just talked about, but it also acts in the brain. And this will increase sex drive and increase aggression. Back when I was in high school, a common term that got thrown around is, oh, that guy's totally got roid rage. And that was related to people who were having too much testosterone, exogenous. They were using performance-enhancing drugs, and they would be very, very aggressive. You look at some of those 1990s movies that talk about college or high school football, and the athletes are all jacked up. That's going to be something related to the aggression associated with increase above normal testosterone, okay? The normal values that we have here are men are between about 250 and 1045 nanograms per deciliter. And this is just based on our normal distribution, okay? Most people are going to fall in this range right there. But naturally, we have athletes and humans that fall out to either ends of this. Now, this is something that has been exploited recently by the pharmaceutical industry to say, oh, you have 250 nanograms per deciliter of testosterone, that means you have low T. I should be able to prescribe a drug to get you from this part of the distribution up to this part of the distribution. Okay? All that's, within the normally occurring range, so they're able to do that. On the female side, we had an article that was just submitted on Caster Semenya, who's a sprinter from South Africa who naturally produces more than 5 nanograms. And if you've taken statistics, you know that 95% of people are going to fall within the standard distribution. Guess what? That leaves 2.5% out here and 2.5% out here. So Caster falls in this region out here. That does not mean that she's taking exogenous drugs to get her testosterone up, but the Olympic Committee has come back and said she is not eligible to participate due to this biochemical advantage that she has due to a gene mutation in her body. And during the lecture today, during the live lecture, a student brought up, well, someone has done a biomechanical evaluation of Michael Phelps and show that he is at a biomechanical, meaning the proportion of his shoulders, arm length, these sorts of things to his overall body length, they place him at a biomechanical advantage to be a great swimmer. All right. So the question is here, neither Michael Phelps nor Caster Semenya have done anything outside of just being a person and training really hard to get good at their sport. Are we going to go out there and tell athletes who are biomechanically advantaged to be good at a sport that they have to get a surgery in order to bring them within these normal, the normal quote unquote, range for that athlete? Do we have to bring Michael Phelps' shoulders in or shorten his arm length because it's not natural for him to have arms that length? No. Then in my thought process, do we have to tell this athlete who has a naturally occurring high production of testosterone that she has to take medications to bring it down? My inclination on that one is no. The Olympic Committee right now has said yes, that athlete does need to decrease her testosterone because it gives her an unfair advantage. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there's a lot more going on with this conversation that we will see over the coming 5 years. But just to give you a view of what those normal values are, men are going to be much higher than females in general, and we'll show in a minute why that happens. So let's move on to the pathway of production and regulation of testosterone. Where do we get testosterone from? Well, it starts up here in the brain, and specifically, it starts in our hypothalamus. In our hypothalamus, in kind of this sensing portion of our brain, we have a hormone called GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. right over here. GnRH, once it senses low circulating concentration of testosterone in the blood, because blood is flowing through this area of the brain, it's going to say, whoa, we got low testosterone. We better do something about this. We're going to release our GnRH to the pituitary gland. Once in the pituitary gland, we are then going to, let's make this a little bit smaller here. We are then going to go this direction to release some FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, right over here. FSH and LH, FSH is mostly going to be focused towards the ovaries in females, and then LH for males and females is going to go to the adrenal gland, and then in males only is going to go to the Leydig cells of the testes. Okay, so let's start in our Leydig cells. What happens once that LH gets there? Well, LH is going to catalyze this reaction right here and take stored cholesterol in the testes and transform that into pregnenolone. Pregnenolone then can be transformed into either progesterone or DHEA. If it is transformed into progesterone, that can go in this direction right here that we're not really talking about, but that's the creation of either cortisol or aldosterone, two other steroid hormones. We'll talk about cortisol a little bit later in the semester because that can be related to performance enhancing as well. But if we go to DHEA, either from progesterone or from pregnenolone, DHEA can then be converted into androstenedione. And this is an interesting one because when I was in high school, there's a baseball player, Mark McGwire, who was breaking the home run record along with Sammy Sosa. And both of these athletes were on androstenedione. Nobody thought anything of it until a bunch of chemists said, hey, by the way, or a bunch of physiologists said, by the way, androstenedione is a precursor to testosterone. It was illegal for athletes to take testosterone, but for them to take androstenedione, no problem. We got no problem with that. The people in charge of Major League Baseball thought about that, and the International Olympic Committee said, that doesn't make any sense at all. The tests were done. Does a person taking androstenedione produce more testosterone? Yes, they do. Does that relate to muscle growth and strength? Yes, it does. And therefore they said, okay, well, now we are going to ban our androstenedione. The reason that's banned is because we see this pathway right here where androstenedione can be converted into testosterone. However, androstenedione can also be converted into our estrogen precursors. Interesting. And those estrogen precursors can then move on to becoming estrogen. Now, this is where we get into some of those, androgenic factors related to testosterone, specifically taking exogenous amounts of it, because there is a reversible reaction here between testosterone and our estrogen precursors. The process that catalyzes that is called aromatization. So if we aromatize our estrogen or our testosterone, we can make that into an estrogen precursor. So when testosterone gets too high in the blood, the body says, whoa, we got too much testosterone. Let's stop producing that from the Leydig cells. Okay, great. But if you're taking in testosterone from exogenous sources, it doesn't matter how much is coming out of the Leydig cells. The body has a secondary action in case that testosterone gets high, and that's aromatization. It's going to aromatize that testosterone into an estrogen precursor, which will then be converted into estrogen. So that's why classically with athletes and people who are taking too much testosterone, you will get the realization of female secondary sex characteristics because estrogen has gone up. Another thing that happens out there is athletes will take testosterone along with an aromatase inhibitor. Oh my gosh, they will try to stop their aromatization of testosterone and the side effects of taking too much testosterone by taking an aromatase inhibitor. We will talk about that a little bit later in the semester as well. But just when the classic example I give of this is people who are taking opioid drugs illegally. They're not taking them as prescribed by their doctor, but they're just taking them. Well, one side effect of taking those drugs is that they will become constipated because it slows down the progression of food through your intestines. So this is like somebody who's illegally taking opioids also taking a drug that stops the constipation that goes along with that. It's like the side effect is really bad. I'm not going to stop taking the drug. I'm just going to take another drug to stop that one side effect so I can keep taking that other drug. Not great. Okay. So that covers what happens in the Leydig cells of the testes. This is where the majority of testosterone production is going to occur. But we also said, hey, we have testosterone being produced in females as well in the ovaries. And how does this happen? Well, it's pretty simple. We have our little epithelial cells here. In the ovary, and as that testosterone is produced, there are enzymes on top of these epithelial cells that help to convert that testosterone into estradiol, maybe something having to do with aromatase. So that's going to help that conversion of testosterone into estradiol. But not 100% of the testosterone is converted in this manner, and that's why we see anywhere from our normal range of 1 to 5 nanograms per deciliter of testosterone in females as well. The last thing that happens is we have a process similar to the process that takes place in the Leydig cells that takes place in the adrenal gland as well. All three of these different glands can produce testosterone in response to FSH and LH. What happens when that testosterone gets produced? All three of these we can see in our pink line right here go on a pathway back to the brain and back to the hypothalamus in general. Once they're in the hypothalamus, we have a negative reaction. Okay, so we are inhibiting our production of GnRH. The hypothalamus will say, whoa, testosterone is nice and high. We don't need to produce anymore. Let's stop our GnRH. If we don't have gonadotropin releasing hormone, then guess what? We're not going to release FSH or LH. If we don't have FSH or LH, we don't have the production of testosterone from our three glands below. So that is kind of the feedback mechanism associated with the production of and the regulation of testosterone within males and females through GnRH and FSH. Okay, we are going to cover, we didn't necessarily get enough time to cover testosterone production or after the production, what happens in the cells. We will cover that on Friday. But I did want to quickly review our side effects of use. We have liver damage, cardiovascular disease, hypogonadism, and the reason that hypogonadism takes place makes a lot of sense, okay? Remember, our gonads in the testes are where those Leydig cells are. And what happens is normally we get that signal from the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, hey, make some testosterone. If you are taking exogenous testosterone, well, your body's going to first off say, whoa, let's stop making testosterone. Okay, pituitary gland, no more FSH and LH. Well, then that person keeps taking exogenous testosterone. The body can't make any less. Well, those cells associated with natural production of testosterone are going to say, well, body doesn't need me. I'm going to get a little smaller. Body still doesn't need me. Testosterone's still high. Get a little smaller. And this is what happens over time. And you will see athletes who normally cycle the use of testosterone because they want to increase their testosterone. But before that, the body gets too used to that, they'll go off exogenous, get that feedback loops going again so their Leydig cells can start producing testosterone. And then once their natural production is back up, okay, now I can go on some more exogenous testosterone to make sure that helps. Doesn't always work, especially over the long term. That kind of fluctuation can have its own negative consequences. So the use of exogenous testosterone without the help of a doctor, not going to be a great idea. As we said, right here, our testosterone is produced from cholesterol. That means it's fat soluble. Just like fat soluble vitamins, you can get toxicity from this. Too much testosterone, not a good thing. It can become toxic. You can have a lot of negative consequences. That's why, look at that, because it's metabolized and in the liver. That's why we can get some toxicity and eventually some liver damage and or death from that. The last one here is an increased transmission risk of HIV. I'm not necessarily sure. The book isn't very clear on why this happens. There's two possible rationales that I can think of. Number one, having increased testosterone physiologically in the body makes it easier for your cells to accept HIV if you are exposed. Number two, which I think is probably more likely, is testosterone is classically used through injections. And if it's being used by injections, there's an increased risk that people are going to start sharing needles. And that could be the potential mechanism of increased HIV risk in people using testosterone. So 5 quick little side effects of the use. Obviously, these are very drastic. These are not like, oh, you're going to notice a little bit of itching skin or something like that. No, these are very dangerous side effects of exogenous use of testosterone, and that's why we see some very negative consequences associated with it as well. Okay, so that's the quick and dirty version of the lecture today. I apologize, this is a little bit shorter and you don't get to watch me writing. I'm putting a sign up right in front of my computer right now that says press record. So hopefully this doesn't happen again in the future. If you have questions on any of this, please get in touch. I'll be happy to meet with anybody by Zoom if you have specific questions as well. So keep that in mind. All right, everybody, that will do it for today's lecture. I will see everybody on Friday.